Previously on ETFW. On our last episode, Brendan and I took a familiar road trip up to the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. There we revisited the beautiful Mount Victoria Museum in hopes for some answers from our previous encounter we had there. Our night started off rather uneventful, but moving into room 16, the most active room in the museum, things changed. Should you wish to view this episode, there will be a card on the top of the screen which will take you to it. In this episode, I meet up with a familiar face on the channel and travel across Sydney Harbour to one of the most historic convict sites in New South Wales. This is ETFW. Follow us as we explore Cockatoo Island. Waiting at the wharf brought on a rather interesting feeling. I have said before that when exploring locations, I like to envision myself in the very era and time that these places were active. But I wasn't on Cockatoo Island yet. Well, this is where the feelings I had were rather strange. The unknown. I can imagine this would have been going through the minds of those stripped from their friends, families, and everything they knew and loved while boarding ships to an unknown land. In my mind, I was in the late 18th century, located in London, and this is where our adventure begins. As the 18th century was coming to a close, the London prison systems came under strain as the rate of crime rose. Overcrowding in jails was a serious issue, and there wasn't enough cells to lock up those who were committing crimes. A solution was needed, and quickly. Across the Pacific Ocean, however, the newly colonised Australia was changing ever so quickly. Those in charge of the London prison system saw an opportunity for convicted criminals in the land down under. So, the decision was made that instead of building new jails in London, they would send criminals on ships to Australia and use them as workers to serve out their punishments in hard labour. Between 1787 and 1868, approximately 166,000 convicts, men, women and children, were transported to Australia and dispersed across 3,000 convict sites nationally, one of those sites being Cockatoo Island. On the 21st of February 1839, Cockatoo Island received its first convicts, a ship carrying 60 criminals from Norfolk Island. They arrived under military supervision and were initially housed in tents on the island. At the time, Cockatoo Island was said to be without clean sources of drinking water and riddled with snakes. However, the new arrivals were put to work quickly, quarrying the island's sandstone for the construction of prison buildings as well as other public works. Today, however, we sit at the wharf, carefree, in good company, waiting for the ferry to take us to a place which many have no idea the hardships that generations before us endured, creating this very beautiful country we live in today. This video isn't about me and my exploration. This video today will be about those who suffered and bringing light to a location that many take for granted. Arriving at Cockatoo Island is always enjoyable. The island has a sense of serenity to it. The majority of times I've visited, I've usually found myself to be one of the only people wandering around. However, these feelings would have been much different for those arriving during the 1800s. As mentioned, the first convicts to arrive were in 1839, and they were put to work right away under the supervision of Charles Ormsby, the superintendent. Charles Ormsby was elected to be the superintendent of Cockatoo Island on the 1st of October 1841. His appointment was somewhat controversial due to his recent suspension from the administration at his previous employment, where he worked inside a prison. Charles was known as a rather rough character. His previous suspension was due to the fact that he ordered inmates to cull a bunch of sheep for his own entertainment. However, the decision was final, and he stepped into his new role as superintendent of Cockatoo Island. Ormsby got to work quickly, having solitary confinement cells built and the introduction of leg irons to be made mandatory. Ormsby was loving life. To him, Cockatoo Island was his personal playing ground, and whatever he saw fit could be implemented, such as the Cat of Nine Tails, which was introduced as punishment. His treatment towards the convicts working on the island was terrible, and malnutrition was abroad. Ormsby also forced those on the island to run his own personal side business, which involved growing and selling cabbage. Ormsby continued as superintendent until being outed in 1859. By this time, there had been 5 inquiries into his actions on the island, which involved his methods of management. A final inquiry was eventually made, and what was discovered shocked many. Ormsby was involved in large amounts of illegal activity, corruption, and even forcing convicts into boxing matches for his own enjoyment. Cockatoo Island's convicts lived in cramped, poorly ventilated, and foul-smelling quarters. Wards intended to accommodate up to 300 prisoners were, at times, occupied by nearly 500. Further, the communal tubs that functioned as toilets were often left standing for hours. This lack of hygiene led to bedbugs, fleas, rats, and diseases. On top of this, convicts were required to complete back-breaking work, such as excavating sandstone, to earn 2 meals a day. Breakfast was a serving of bland porridge, and dinner consisted of meat and bread. If a convict didn't complete their work, they would go to bed hungry. Walking around the island today and knowing its cruel history, you can't help but shake the feeling of sadness. Even though the convicts who were sent here were convicted criminals, not all were bad people, and not all deserved to endure many hard years of constant punishment. In the years leading up to the closure of Cockatoo Island's penal establishment in 1869, the prisoner population declined significantly. When the penal establishment ceased operating, the remaining prisoners were transferred to Darlinghurst Jail. However, Cockatoo Island's prison buildings weren't vacant for long. In 1871, they were repurposed for an industrial school for girls and a separate reformatory. In 1888, the former prison buildings at Cockatoo Island reverted to housing criminals to alleviate overcrowding at Darlinghurst Jail. By the time the prison's closure in 1908, it housed only female prisoners. When all remaining prisoners were relocated to Little Bay that year, the island's function as a jail ended for good. Cockatoo Island's history is beyond rich. The stories from this location could captivate the keen listener for hours. However, in this video, I'll keep it brief. My adventures to Cockatoo Island were short. We have plans to return and stay the night, conducting paranormal investigations throughout. However, on all my previous visits, all the campsites had already been booked out. Consider this video a short teaser for what is to come. I do hope you all enjoy the brief history I shared. I know I haven't touched on the entire past, however, there will be videos in the very near future carrying on from this one. With that said, thank you all for watching. Next week's video is an absolute beauty, and at a location I've wanted to visit for over 1 year, so stay tuned. Peace.